Hello, everyone, and welcome to Overtime. Today is our weekly Ukraine update with Operator Starsky. We have not been able to get in touch with Operator Starsky. This does happen intermittently. We are not the only show that has this problem. So we do have today with us Commander McMillan, and we have 𝐒𝐤𝐬𝐿𝐴𝐷𝑒𝑟𝑖𝑛G, and we are hoping that... oh, yeah, actually, Commander, I am going to ask you to mute, if you don't mind. All right, thank you. We are hoping to get Operator Starsky here. He is still scheduled, and he has on occasion come in somewhat late. It does happen, so we will see how that goes. Commander, what are conditions in Ukraine that would be affecting his ability to connect with us?
Well, we know that the Russians are continuing their missile and air bombardment of civilian infrastructure, and the primary target thus far seems to be the power grid and power generation systems. That in turn, of course, would affect his ability to get electricity to be able to broadcast, both because he might not have it, although we know that he has a large battery pack which supports his ability to, run electrical items in his home. But it also affects electrical energy being able to go to cell towers and such. So being able to get his message out of Ukraine may be difficult. And he's not the only one. I've noticed that several of the Ukrainian bloggers that I follow on YouTube, for example, have not been posting anywhere near as regularly as they used to. So this is, I think, going to be an ongoing issue for some time as the Russians continue all this bombardment of civilian infrastructure.
So even if he has power, which we hope he does, and we think he has at least some, because we know he does, he was able to get a large... I think he had said it was a generator, but I think it was actually a battery pack. It's what you put it. It was large, and he can.
Oh, yeah.
He can. So he can charge that when he's got power, and then run it. Even if that's okay, the towers that transmit the Wi-Fi may be down, and in fact, my understanding is that the internet connectivity across Ukraine is down to now less than 20% of what it should or normally is. All right, so that's any number of and now Dick Dawson is in the live chat, and he has said that he as well is trying to get in contact with Operator Starsky. Operator Starsky is scheduled to be on the shills tomorrow. There may be issues with that, so we wish everyone the best of luck in getting there. But so we're going to try to keep, and if we're always concerned. He's in Kyiv. Kyiv has been hit. It's been hit before, but he's staying as safe as he can, and we still get concerned when we don't hear from him. If you join us on our Discord, we update what we know when we know it there. We are also, of course, doing all our regular news updates and what's going on in Ukraine, and we have some interesting things to discuss today. We are on. It's unfortunate that we're missing Starsky. And again, he may come in. I'm not optimistic, but we'll wait and we will do the show. And we do have Commander McMillan, who is always an invaluable resource. So, Commander, what's been going on in the last week in Ukraine?
It's, again, primarily all this bombardment activity. The Russians have been firing upwards of 100 missiles every day. They're doing a fairly good job of suppressing the power grid throughout the entire country. We've heard reports as many as 80% of the population are without power at various times. They're not just striking different targets every time they fire, they're retargeting certain areas when they have some indication that those areas have been repaired and that the grid in that region is back online. They just hit it again. This, of course, is causing enormous misery and suffering amongst the civilian population in those areas, because they're left without power and water, but it also needs to be stated that this is the winter and it's very cold there. Temperatures are hovering just above freezing during the day, and during the night it drops below freezing. So that gives you an idea how bad things can be if you're going for multiple days without any electrical power. Things are going to be pretty awful. In terms of operations on the ground, there's really not a lot going on.
Why isn't there a lot going on?
Well, that's what I'm getting at, is the reason there isn't a lot going on is, again, because of the weather. The weather is such that there's a lot of snow or rainfall that turns the countryside into a giant morass of mud. And even though they've got lots of tracked vehicles operating around there, the mud can be deep and dense enough that the tracked vehicles, let alone anything that's a wheeled vehicle, will literally sink up to its hull and bottom out in the mud and can't make any distance. So that restricts operations pretty much to the road network. And if you're stuck on the road network, it's very easy for your opposition to put down lines of fire which prevent you from advancing without taking hideous casualties. And so everything is pretty much at this point stopped. The only areas that there are ground operations of any significance going on are in the central sector, where the Russians are continuing to conduct infantry assaults out of the trench lines. This is very reminiscent of almost like World War I at the Somme activities. They're just sending troops over the top to try to swarm the enemy defenses, and they're taking enormous casualties in doing so, and not making a heck of a lot of ground, but they are making ground. It looks like what they're trying to do is encircle Bakhmut. This is interesting because up until now, they've pretty much gone head on into the fortified positions at Bakhmut and taking a lot of casualties. By trying to go around, that lessens the number of casualties they're suffering. It also means that they've perhaps realized that it's a foregone conclusion that they won't be able to take the city by direct assault. So they want to encircle it, cut it off, and then reduce it from behind and starve it out. So that seems to be what's going on there. We know that they're taking lots of casualties, the Russians are. The last figures I've seen, depending on the sources consulted, is that the Russians have suffered upwards of 70 to up to perhaps over 90,000 dead since the start of the war. And if you go by the standard military thumb rule of about a 3-to-1 ratio, that means somewhere close to 250 to 300,000 wounded. So when you add all that together plus POWs, you've got something in the range of 500,000 casualties all told for the Russians. Now, this is interesting because apparently at the state dinner the other night, one of the topics that came up in discussions was the issue of casualties, and somebody at that, I don't know if it was Macron or Biden, said that the Ukrainians have suffered 13,000 dead troops. I honestly am a little surprised and incredulous with that figure. I don't know how truthful or accurate it is, because it seems far, far lower than I would have anticipated at this stage. I'm sure the casualties are higher than 13,000, but I also
you mentioned
know
the Russian.
Yeah, go ahead.
You mentioned the Russian casualties and that they're taking hideous losses.
Yeah.
How long can they sustain losses like that before there just isn't an army left?
They're kind of approaching that point to some extent. That's why you see these massive mobilization call-ups. The conscripts that are being brought in are also apparently being sent almost directly to the front, even though that technically violates Russian law, but they've kind of thrown the law out the window at this point. They're scraping the bottom of the barrel by going into the prisons and trying to recruit there, offering amnesties. Apparently, Wagner Group has even gone further than that, and they're just kind of conscripting troops out of the prisons and making a point of recruiting the most violent criminals and forming special companies and detachments of those guys. This is a tactic that was kind of used by the Soviets during World War II, where they formed what were called wild battalions. And, it was penal units that they took out of the penal system in the Gulag and Siberia and such. And they just formed them of these guys, and they were used for literally suicidal missions. And the hope was that if they got into enemy lines, the level of violence that they were likely to perpetrate on the enemy would cause fear and morale loss, and people would rout. That was the hope. It doesn't seem to have ever been successful in World War II. Similarly, I doubt it will be successful here, but if you're taking those people and loosing them on a civilian population in an occupied area, you can imagine what's going on. We're talking murderers, rapists, that kind of thing.
So if they do get to that point of, they just don't have any more grist to throw into the mill, which, it seems like they're heading in that direction pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you see the war effort turning, at least on the Russian side? Do you think they're more likely to negotiate at that point, or are they just going to switch?
I don't think so. I think we're seeing what they're doing right now is what is happening when you can't sustain a ground operation. And that's, you're relying on bombardment. You're trying to terrorize the enemy population into pressuring their government to going to the negotiating table and making concessions to the Russians to give them at least something that they can walk away with from such negotiations and declare victory. The mission accomplished banner kind of thing.
And how long can they keep that up?
What, the missiles?
Yeah.
The missiles and or conscripting unwilling people to just throw them at Ukraine.
The mass conscription stuff, I think, can go on for a fair amount of time. You look at countries that have done this in the past, and every time that they say they've kind of scraped the bottom of the barrel, they find another way to shave off another layer and just keep going lower and lower. You end up getting, 60-year-old pensioners handed a rifle and say, go to the front. You get grade school kids even being given weapons and sent to the front.
Jesus.
I think they're trying to avoid that. They have, if you look at the reports that are coming out, it looks like they've been trying to make a conscious effort of doing the bulk of the conscription from levels of society that will not cause as much disruption politically as others might. So you go to ethnic minority areas, you go to impoverished areas, you recruit, as we've been saying, from the prisons, you go to mental hospitals and recruit, that kind of stuff. And that's what they've been doing. I think at some point, if they want to continue this, they're going to have to say, okay, we need to just start taking the rest of the people that we've been kind of steering clear of. And then you start getting into stripping industry of people. That in turn affects your ability to continue the war because you can't make the weapons you need. You can't produce the goods you need to sell on foreign markets to generate revenue to continue to purchase critical supplies that you need overseas for your weapons and so forth. And that gets into the question of how long can they continue this bombardment.
It also, I would imagine, once they start getting to that level, that's going to have a pretty deleterious effect upon the morale and opinions of the general.
Oh yeah, it's already, it's very obviously already doing that. We're getting lots of reports of acts of sabotage, vandalism, even months ago when they first started declaring the mobilization of the reservists, there were people that were lobbing firebombs into recruiting stations. We're now getting reports of, mysterious train derailments and things like that. So there's some low-level activity. The big issue right now, if you're thinking in those terms, is twofold. Number one, historically, you don't find a lot of bottom-up agitation throughout Russian history. The people are kind of, I don't want to say genetically, but psychologically, they've been conditioned over literally centuries to be obedient to higher authority. So you don't tend to see a lot of bottom-up agitation. Change typically occurs top-down. So you get, during Tsarist time.
Well, we may have, all right, it appears like we may have lost Macmillan. This has happened before. There he is. Which is why Macmillan's a complete joke, and I have no idea why we even have. Oh, he's back. How are you, sir? We missed every second you were gone. We missed you. Let me interrupt real quick and say, just as a reminder,
space aliens were gentle.
Oh dear Lord. Well, I'm disappointed to hear that.
What year is it?
Just a reminder to everybody that on any of these Starsky shows, whether he makes it or not, we have spoken with him about what charity he would like to support. The charity should be in the description. It doesn't always make it in. If it hasn't, it's in the description for previous shows, and I will put it back in to make sure it's there. But all super chats go entirely to that charity, and that's per Starsky's request. So any super chats for the show go to a charity helping out in Ukraine. Anyways, I apologize. Well, I don't know why I'm apologizing. I didn't disconnect you. What you were saying, Commander?
Yeah, I was saying something. I don't really remember where the conversation was.
we were in the middle of the psychological conditioning of not rising up. Yeah. And that was the first option, and then there was also a second one that you were going to touch on.
From below that will change. I think there is a distinct possibility you will get agitation from above that will force the change. I don't see that we're going to have the war come to a conclusion until one of those two things occurs, because realistically, Putin needs to be able to come out of this with the ability to say that I won something. And Zelensky has pretty much said already, I have no intention of giving in to any of those demands. These are my demands, and the war will end as soon as the Russians agree to meet those. And, it's basically full restoration of all Ukrainian territory, return.
We appear to
reparations. Am I going away again? Yeah.
You appear to be back.
Interesting. So, the key is that I don't think it'll be the Russian leader, and I don't think Putin will be the one who will have to cave for the war to end. It will have to come from Zelensky's side. unless you get somebody removing Putin from office. And then you have a question of who replaces him, and are they going to be more or less likely to want to negotiate an end? The dangerous part there, as I have mentioned a couple times before, is that the likely people who would end up replacing Putin are the ultranationalists, and they've already said repeatedly that they think Putin's failure here is that he's holding back. And if you read between the lines, what that means is they want to employ all strategic level resources available to Russia to achieve their goals. In other words, nuclear, chemical type weaponry being used against Ukraine. That in turn, as we've also talked about, is very strongly likely to trigger NATO intervention of some sort. And so what is a regional conflict between Ukraine and Russia could very easily escalate to something on the level of World War III.
Now, I'm no expert, but I've looked into other kinds of coups that have happened, changes of regimes that have happened in the past, and it always seems that when this happens, the side that has the support of the military seems to be the one that ends up winning power. And it's very difficult if you don't have the support of the military on your side. Of the different options that may, or different powers inside of Russia that may be vying for power should, Putin be deposed, where do you see the loyalty of the military ending up going? I mean, if you get the ultranationals in there, they're wanting to ramp up military attack tremendously, apparently. So is the military going to be up for that, or do you think that they would rather support maybe let's negotiate an end to this so we can stop taking these casualties? Where do you think the military's loyalty would lie on that?
The problem here is that when you say military in Russia, it means something a little different than what it would mean to a Western country like the U.S. When you say military in the United States, everybody thinks of, Department of Defense, Army, Air Force, Marines, National Guard, Army Reserves, etc. They're all one big lump entity. In Russia, it isn't that way. So you would have the active army, then you have a reserve army, then you have the Ministry of the Interior, the MVD, which has its own private army. And then you've got the private military groups like the Wagner Group. And then you've got regional, I'll call them warlords, because effectively that's what they are, in some of the ethnic outlying regions who have their own private armies. And so if a movement starts to overthrow Putin, the question is, which of those armies are loyal? And do you end up in a Russian civil war scenario where the army is fighting the MVD and the Wagner groups and so on? And is it a two-sided, Putin versus whoever's trying to overthrow him, or a multi-sided civil war where you've got different warlords fighting each other? Some are kind of loosely aligned with Putin. Some are kind of loosely aligned with the folks, who are the ultranationalists who are trying to overthrow him, but they're all working against one another because they all want to come out on top. It's something you see in a lot of authoritarian states where the leadership deliberately does that. They divide up the military power specifically to make it difficult for their opponents or their rivals to mount a coup, because they don't have the ability to secure everybody's allegiance to overthrow. And it's that uncertainty that often holds them in check. And I suspect that's kind of what's going on right now, because, and I'm just saying this as a for instance, if the ultranationalists have the allegiance of regional warlords, and maybe even the MVD, but they don't have the allegiance of the regular army, there's no sense of certainty that the coup could succeed. So they're less likely to jump and make the move. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I guess I can see where that could end up being a problem. And how in the heck are you going to want to try and instigate a takeover of the government because if you lose, the stakes are pretty high. I mean, traditionally, the people who try and overthrow a government and fail, they're not long for the world. So I guess I can see where you would want to ensure that you have a really good chance of doing this before you were to jump.
Right.
So, oh yeah, please.
Certain elements are more likely to go to an opposition force than others are. And so there's this constant behind the scenes turmoil of the leadership of Putin's side and the leadership of the opposition side trying to feel out the leaders in each of these military organizations about, well, can I count on you if we do something, without actually saying I'm planning to do something, because it's very easy in that case if you say, yeah, I want to stage a coup and I want you to back me, and the guy says, oh yeah, I'll back you, and immediately runs to the other side and says, hey, Putin, guess what this guy told me? Yeah, so I've said it several times in the various discussions and interviews we've done on here. At this point, I don't see that the real war is what's happening on the ground in Ukraine or even the missile bombardment. The real war is what's going on behind closed doors in the Kremlin. It's who's going to either Putin stay in power or who's going to replace him. That's what the real struggle is right now. And it'll be the outcome of that struggle that decides which way the war goes in terms of, does it continue to drag on, or is there a chance that we can come to a negotiated settlement of some sort?
So we have a couple of questions that I'd like to get to. One is from he who shall not be named, who says, quote, I strongly suspect a fascist group recruiting violent criminals may have its own agenda. Do you, Commander, have any opinions on that?
I think so. I don't disagree with that line of thinking. If you're recruiting those people into your force, they know that their freedom depends on their loyalty to you. So, yeah, that's a force that you could easily say is going to be loyal in a coup, because they will probably rightfully assume that should the coup succeed and the leader of said coup be indebted to them, then they have a better chance of remaining free or rising up in the power structure. I mean, if you look at, for example, the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, many of the people who were in the Bolshevik movement were technically criminals. I mean, Stalin, for example, was a bank robber. And, you know, when you're in that position, if you win, you now become part of the establishment rather than an outsider who's a criminal. And you can rise in the ranks of that the new establishment. So yeah, recruiting those kind of people definitely puts you in a position to have a kind of lockstep loyalty group that will follow you whichever way you go.
Almost your own private army.
Yeah, and there's a lot of those. I'll still be here. I just have to go open the door. I'll be right back.
All right.
You can ask me. I can still hear you and talk.
Oh, perfect. So, actually, I'll get to that question in a second. We did hear that there's been some back channel talks about at least coming to the table and negotiating. And Russia has, in fact, put out an olive branch and issued a a compromise deal that they would accept. What was that deal?
I honestly don't know. So if you've heard something and I haven't, you need to tell me what it is.
Well, the opening offer from the Russians, unofficially, if I recall, was the dissolution of the complete surrender of Ukraine and the dissolution of the Ukrainian government.
Oh, that one. Okay, you were saying, you were kind of being facetious then. Yeah. Well, the Russians have come out basically and said that is their only desired end state from this. So they either are going to have to be defeated outright, or they want to make Ukraine go away and reincorporate that territory into Russia. And of course, the Ukrainian position is just the opposite, which is we want full restoration of all the territories and all the people back, and reparations to rebuild all the damage you've done, and so on. So these are not two sides that are anywhere close to being able to enter a negotiated settlement of the war at this point.
Yeah, I think that would be awfully generous to try and couch it in any way as like, oh, they're willing to negotiate. All it will take is just the complete and utter domination and winning of the war.
Yeah.
So I want to talk weapons systems briefly. We've heard, so now
sure,
Russia has escalated the missile strikes. Ukraine is, as I recall now, over 80% without power. The internet is down to, at best, less than 20% of connectivity that they're getting. We've had reports,
that's intermittent,
and we've actually seen also, we've seen hospitals that have to perform surgery with somebody holding their iPhone over and using the light on the iPhone so that the surgeons can see what they're doing. We now believe, and well, we've seen that Russia appears to be arming and fueling bombers, and people are concerned that what this means is they're about to bring in a whole bunch of bombers and either supplement the missile strikes, meaning they will escalate significantly if they do that, or maybe pull back on the missiles and use the bombers instead. But in any case, we see these bombers being fueled. What's your take on that?
I know you have a graphic. I don't know if you can put it up or not, but
I can.
If you look at the aircraft, these are strategic bombers. These are not tactical ground support aircraft, or even deep penetration strike aircraft. These are things that are normal. The aircraft in question that you're talking about that we have satellite imagery of them at one particular airfield where they normally don't see these aircraft. These would be the Russian equivalent of like B-52s or B-2s or what have you. They're designed for and intended for carrying nuclear weapons. Now, as with our B-52s and B-2s, that does not mean that they cannot be used in a conventional role. They can. And we have, in the past, frequently used our B-52s and B-2s for those kind of operations. So the supposition is that the Russians are staging these strategic level assets in a position where they can support the continued bombardment offensive of Ukraine. It does not mean that they're going to use nuclear weapons. I'm not ruling that out. I'm just saying that the supposition right now is those aircraft are being brought in for additional conventional munitions delivery. So they're trying either to up the ante, or it could be that they're running out of the missiles that they have been using up to this point, and in order to continue the bombardment at roughly the same level, they need to bring in these larger bombers to deliver ordnance to maintain that level of destruction. Now, it presents an interesting situation because unless they're using standoff missiles, and again, those are, for the Russians, missiles that are primarily intended for strategic level use, in other words, nuclear weapons delivery. And again, those missiles can be reconfigured to deliver just a conventional warhead. But it means they're taking strategic level assets and reallocating them for use in the war in Ukraine in a conventional role. Why is this important? Because it shows that the continuation of the war with the only means they currently have available for conducting that war, which is this bombardment, they're reinforcing that level of their force structure to continue that bombardment or increase the bombardment. This is, in a lot of ways, a tacit, if you interpret it this way, a tacit admission that their forces on the ground are no longer capable of affecting the outcome of the conflict. And the only means they have to affect the outcome of the conflict is to continue or increase the level of bombardment that they're conducting against the civilian population.
So with these assets being deployed, do we have any evidence or any indications that anybody's thinking of potential nuclear strike, or is it just we're seeing the movement of these supplies for conventional means rather than their more standard?
Right. My interpretation would be that these are all intended for conventional use. It does not mean that they couldn't be used in a nuclear war role. They could, but the question then becomes, is it strictly against Ukraine? And if they use nuclear weapons against Ukraine, we're pretty certain at this point that NATO is kind of, through back channel communications, told the Russians in no uncertain terms, if you employ nuclear weapons in Ukraine, we will intervene. So
we're not seeing the any kinds of steps that we would expect to see in preparing nuclear weapons. I mean, it's
right,
not
because
like they're launching ICBMs, but
right. If you were going to use nuclear weapons against Ukraine, which you know will trigger a NATO intervention, then you would assume that all the strategic forces would be readied in a position where, in case war were to occur, they would be able to deliver nuclear weapons on a strategic level, strike against, all of Europe, against the United States, etc. And we're not seeing that. All we're seeing is this portion of the strategic forces being moved closer to the front lines in order to, we presume, conduct conventional strikes against Ukraine.
So I can go ahead and not dust out my fallout shelter.
Yeah, exactly. The corollary of that, however, is really interesting. It's that effectively they're taking about 20% of their strategic level forces and exposing them and using them to conduct this conventional bombardment of Ukraine, which means, to my thinking, they don't anticipate an escalation of a war which might result in a strategic level exchange between them and the Western alliance. Because why else would you move those forces? Because if you anticipate there is going to be a strategic level war, then you would keep those assets in a position where they would operate in their strategic role. So to my mind, this kind of emphasizes that they're probably not thinking of nuking or using chemical weapons against the Ukraine.
So in essence, by essentially degrading or dismantling a portion of their strategic forces for use in the tactical engagement, that to my understanding is telling you two things. One, that the ground troops are not capable of moving forward, so they have to make this kind of sacrifice. And two, that they're willing to make this kind of sacrifice because they don't anticipate the need of the strategic level forces, which suggests that they are not intending on antagonizing NATO in a way that NATO would engage. Is that a correct overview?
Absolutely. That's exactly what I'm saying. And I don't know how else to really interpret it. Because if they were intending to, get NATO involved, or anticipated they would do something that would get NATO involved, those assets would be in different locations, and we would see preparations for use of nuclear weapons, which we have not seen.
We've had a question about the long-range weaponry of Ukraine, but I'm going to split that into two questions because it also included, should we send them Patriot missiles or stuff like that? So I'm going to split that into two questions, and we'll start with the planes. My understanding is that the Russians do not control the airspace over Ukraine. Bombers are reasonably easy to shoot down, and this is not the kind of vehicle that is really good for engaging in those kinds of situations. Has something changed, or I mean, it sounds, based on my understanding, that these bombers it sounds kind of crazy, because my understanding is they from what I'm looking at, they're going to take some pretty serious casualties. Is that accurate?
Potentially. What I think is likely to happen is that these strategic bombers are not going to be used in a, World War II bombing campaign against Germany or Japan, where we flew over and dropped tons of bombs on them. That's not what they're going to do. These aircraft are designed and configured to carry large missiles that in wartime, in a strategic role, would have nuclear warheads on them. They're long-range missiles. So they don't need to fly into Ukraine and expose themselves to Ukrainian air defenses. So they would fire their missiles presumably from inside Russia, or perhaps from over Belarusian airspace. And that's what they would be doing. The bombers themselves would be relatively invulnerable to interception if they did that. I don't see them going into Ukraine for precisely the reason you mentioned. The Russians do not have air superiority, let alone air supremacy, over Ukrainian airspace. Right now, there's arguably air parity, and there's even some indication that the Ukrainians, to a degree, actually have air superiority over their own airspace. What we're seeing is Russian aircraft, if they do come inside, they only come very near the combat zone. They don't go do deep penetration strikes. They're only supporting the front line forces, and they only remain over Ukrainian territory, as opposed to Russian-controlled Ukrainian territory, for a very brief period before turning around and exiting. So the notion of sending in these relatively vulnerable strategic level bombers in such an environment seems absurd, because they're just going to get shot out of the air easily.
Are there any new weapon systems that the U.S. or any other countries are considering? We already know the largest supplier of weapons to Ukraine right now is Russia.
Is Russia?
It's Russia. They're the largest.
I love the irony of that.
And it's not a joke. It's Russia. It's because they've been leaving so quickly. Oh, and that reminds me of one other question I didn't want to ask. But they've been leaving so quickly. They've been abandoning their equipment and fleeing.
Oh, yeah.
And the Ukrainians just pick it up, and now about half of all Ukrainian equipment that they're using in the war has come from Russia. So would like to thank Russia for their contribution to helping fight the Russians in their, all right. So outside of Russia, are there countries that are contributing to weapon systems in Ukraine? Are there any new weapon systems that are expected, and are you personally Can you think of any weapon systems that you would like to see that you think realistically we could or should put in there?
In terms of new weapon systems that have been put into Ukraine or being talked about being sent to Ukraine, there's not much. Much of it that is being talked about are actually air warning radars. So it will let the Ukrainians know when a missile strike is inbound, where it's likely targeted, so they can use their air defenses, alert them and try to shoot down the inbound strike. And what we know is that we've already given them, plus the stuff that's being talked about getting to them, they'll have a very robust air defense system. The two systems that they have been trying to get and thus far have kind of been met with a fair degree of opposition. One is the Israeli Iron Dome system, which the Israelis have been using for years now to protect themselves from short to medium range missiles being fired by Hezbollah, various Islamic supported groups inside Palestine and or particularly out of Lebanon. It's a very effective short-range defense system. Putting that, if they had it, over, say, Kiev or Lvov, any of the big cities, would do an enormous amount of good in being able to protect those cities from inbound Russian missiles. The Israelis are reluctant to give them that system because it's kind of their top-end technology, and they're worried about information of it falling into other hands, which would then potentially leave their cities exposed to bombardment by their Arab neighbors. So it's understandable to some extent why they would be reluctant to do that. I know those negotiations are still ongoing. There have been suggestions in some of the press releases that the two sides are coming closer to an agreement to perhaps release that system to the Ukrainians, but it's still in the discussion phases. The other system that the Ukrainians really want is the U.S. Patriot air defense system. The big advantage that Patriot would give them, if we were to give them some of them, is that Patriot is capable of intercepting inbound ballistic missiles, high angle. For lack of a better word, let's call it an ICBM that has a conventional warhead on it. It's a big rocket, but it follows a very high trajectory. It's difficult for other systems to intercept it because when the missile's coming down, it's such a ridiculously high speed that normal air defense missiles can't really do it. But Patriot is specifically designed for and capable of conducting those interceptions. We don't want, again, like the Israelis, don't want to release Patriot to the Ukrainians because it's top-end technology for us, and we're concerned about giving it to somebody who potentially is in a position where that system might fall into enemy hands, or somebody might, purloin it and sell it on the black market to somebody to reverse engineer, like the Russians or Chinese. So where they're going with that, I don't know. Again, I'm sure that those discussions are still continuing. Providing they can get some sort of assurance, then maybe we might give it to them. Those are the two key systems that the Ukrainians have been asking for. They've also been asking for tanks. Part of the problem in them conducting their offensive operations right now is that they're using Russian tanks, and the bulk of the tanks they have are I don't want to call them older model because that suggests they're obsolete. They're not. The ones that they have in greatest number are T-72s, and that's kind of what the Russians are using. What they wanted to do is get hold of more advanced NATO tanks of, like, say, Leopard 2 or the American Abrams or the French Leclerc and that kind of stuff. And I'm not sure why, but there's been a great deal of reluctance on the part of NATO to give modern armored vehicles to the Ukrainians. There are some technical issues on that because there's technology that they don't, the Russians don't have access to and such, and we don't want them to know what all our systems on those advanced tanks are. But even if you gave them older model tanks, which they do know all about, it's still it's problematic to release it to the Ukrainians because it's tapping into NATO force levels. Much of the equipment we have been giving them is equipment that we're either phasing out or we have more modern versions of that equipment that we're bringing into our own service. For example, HIMARS, which we gave them. It's a very high-end modern system, but we have more advanced mods to those systems. And we're holding those parts of the HIMARS system back, but we're giving them the older versions, which are still far, far more capable than anything the Russians are able to deploy. The concern is if we gave, let's say M2 or M1A2s to the Ukrainians, that's putting technology within the grasp of the Russians that we don't want them to have. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and would be willing to, as sad as it is to say, well, right now Ukraine is holding its own, but I think some of these systems would be sitting there going like, if Ukraine has to lose, we can't risk like with, say, a nuclear thing, which we wouldn't give them anyway. But there's clearly systems that are so advanced and so powerful that we're like, we can't. And with the Patriot or the Iron Dome, the other thing is too, it's not just that, and you implied this, but I wanted to expand on this a second. It's not just that they could reverse engineer it and build it themselves or do anything like that, but once they know how it operates, they know what its vulnerabilities are and how to get around it so that they can build systems.
Exactly.
Yeah. So,
well, there's a pretty large, like before the breakout and even continuing now, there's a pretty large black market for weapons in Ukraine as well. So you think maybe some of their reluctance to higher tier stuff, such as the tanks and things, even if Ukraine wins, those things could still end up disappearing into the black market.
Exactly. Now, the flip side of that this is the troubling element that troubling to me, is that there are older tier tanks, for example, that several countries have talked about giving to Ukraine that get stopped. There's some sort of behind the scenes discussion between NATO members, and those deals that one NATO member said, oh yeah, I'll give them this, somehow that deal gets canceled. And an example of this is, I believe it was Spain offered to give the Ukrainians 50 Leopard 1s. Now understand, the Leopard 1 is an old, obsolete vehicle, and in many cases isn't being used. There are very few countries in NATO that still use the Leopard 1, and most of those countries have the Leopard 1 in reserve formations, not frontline formations. It doesn't have any super technology, but it's definitely a better, or at least an equal tank to the T-72s that are being used on the Ukrainian battlefield right now. And that deal that the Spanish had offered to the Ukrainians got turned off within less than a week of the offer being made. And I don't know why, and I don't know what's going on there, but definitely some influence was being exerted by somebody to say, no, don't give them these tanks. So there's some other element that's going on here that we may not be aware of, that we aren't considering from higher end power politics.
All right. I have two more questions. One I want to save till the very end. But so I'm going to ask one question. I'm going to make sure everybody has said that we're up to date and everyone feels like we've examined what we need to examine for today. And I'll ask my final question. So my second to last question. You had said when you and I were chatting about this something, and I vaguely understand what you meant, but I don't, and it may not be a big thing, so maybe you're just going to laugh at me and say I'm being silly and question over. But you had pointed out that this gives NATO the switching the strategic bombers for tactical use gives NATO kind of an excuse to do the same thing, which I'm not sure what you meant by that, but you had said that this could lead to NATO, if I remember correctly, you maybe even said like doing like a first strike on a strategic level, and I'm not sure, and I may have gotten it wrong. So do you remember that?
Yeah, please. I do. I'll clarify. So if we assume that, I hate doing this because this is what's called PSYOP math, Strategic Integrated Operational Plan. It's nuclear warfare planning. But the rough idea is that if both sides are at parity and have a level of nuclear strength in their arsenals to mutually destroy one another, that's the mutually assured destruction, MAD theory, which is that if you launch, I can still utterly destroy you and you can utterly destroy me. It's the world comes to an end, basically, if we get a massive strategic nuclear exchange. But if you assume that we're at parity, but then you remove, well, let me see if I can do this with my thumb. So if you remove 20% of your arsenal and you make it only available for tactical use, and I still have 100% of mine, in theory, if I were to conduct a first strike against you, pop, I will take out yours and you don't have enough to retaliate to completely destroy me.
All right, that's going to be worthy of its own show. I don't want to get into it too deeply, but just to in maybe
Would
2
you
minutes.
Like to play a game?
Yes, it literally is the old War Games movie with Matthew Broderick. It's that exact mindset that goes on.
So to try to give a 2-minute rundown of this, the whole point of the nuclear triad in the U.S. is to ensure that even if you were able to get a successful strike and wipe out the entire continental U.S., we still would have the ability to retaliate and wipe you out. So even if it was, because we've got subs and you can't take out all the subs. So essentially, we've this triad of security where you can take out any one corner of it and either of the remaining two can finish you off. This is what allows MAD to work if it is called working.
So let me clarify for the audience here. When we say nuclear triad, it's 3 elements. Number 1 is aircraft, conventional strategic bomber aircraft that fly over and drop nuclear weapons. That's what the Russians are now repositioning that we see, okay? That's one leg of the triad. The second leg is ICBMs, so extremely long-range missiles that you can fire from the U.S. that will hit any target in Russia and vice versa. Those, generally speaking, are fired from fixed silos. The Russians do have some missiles that can be fired from a rail car. So they have them on their rail system and they move them around, but it's still considered that part of the triad because they only have special sites where they can fire them from. The third part of the triad is strategic ballistic missile submarines, like our Ohio class. And those three parts of the triad, the idea is, okay, you can conduct a first strike and you can wipe out all of my aircraft and you could wipe out all of my, I got to be careful which finger I'm leaving standing here.
Appreciate it.
You wipe out all my aircraft, yeah. And you could wipe out all my subs, but I still have my missiles left to fire at you. And the missiles alone are sufficient to destroy your country. That's the idea, is you can take out any two legs of that triad, but you still have the third. And trying to take out all three legs of the triad becomes physically impossible because it's so big, so robust, and in so many different locations and so many different capabilities. That's the concept. And the Russians have their own nuclear triad, just like we do. What we're saying is that they, by doing this movement of these aircraft into a tactical position, they're taking one of the three legs of their triad and cutting off the first 10 feet of a 50-foot tower.
Yes. Well, and my understanding is actually they've kind of moved away from a triad and already have sort of degraded their own capabilities there because they didn't want to maintain their missiles.
And as have we to a large extent, because there's kind of a realization that the aircraft leg of that triad really is not viable in a modern environment. It is far too easy to eliminate the inbound aircraft. Even if you have the inbound aircraft carrying long-range missiles and all you're using the aircraft for is to get those cruise missiles in closer to the enemy territory before you launch them, they're still vulnerable. So the idea is the triad is actually now just two legs, and reallocating these aircraft out of the strategic arsenal into a tactical arsenal really doesn't have that big an impact. But it's certainly something that's got to be part of the considerations in the decision-making process of moving those aircraft.
All right, Xandring, any final questions before we wrap this up? Like I said, I do have one I want to ask, and it's gonna take a few minutes to answer, but I'm going to wait on that. So, Xandring, any final questions? He may be muted, or we may have lost him. So I'll check again in a minute.
Go ahead.
Oh, there you go. So, any final questions?
Nope. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Commander, anything that we missed that you think is worth discussing or important for people understanding what's going on right now? And if you could not give, if you could just not give my audience the finger, I'd appreciate it.
Sure. I think the key takeaway here is that right now it does not look like this war is anywhere near to a point where it will start the end process. I think both sides are firmly entrenched in their I get everything, you get nothing mindsets. And until both sides are in a position where they're willing to start talking about compromises, willing to not fully realize all their goals, it's going to continue to roll along. The big danger here is that at least the way we're seeing the war prosecuted right now is that Russia could literally pull their troops out of Ukraine entirely and just continue this bombardment that they're doing right now. And in doing so, they become nearly invulnerable because the Ukrainians have thus far shown no inclination to doing any attacks of significance inside Russia proper. And indeed, the question is whether they even have the capability. So if they can't strike back and the Russians can, it becomes a one-sided war that goes on indefinitely until the Ukrainians finally say, okay, we've had enough. We don't want to continue to have our cities and our families bombarded constantly by you. What can we negotiate a way that will bring an end to the war? And that's the biggest problem I see right now, is that until we get a way that Russia proper is being dealt the level of suffering that they are willing to come to the negotiation table, there's no end. And the only weapon, so to speak, that the Ukrainians have in that deadly mathematics is to inflict more and more and more casualties on the Russian forces. And until Russian mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters get so fed up with seeing their young men being brought home in body bags or simply disappearing off the rolls of the unit that they were attached to, until they get fed up with that, this is going to keep rolling on. And that's the only weapon the Ukrainians really have to try to force the war to conclude, is to continue inflicting massive amounts of casualties on the Russian army.
If the Russians do that, if the Russians basically withdraw all their troops and just keep hurling missiles, which they can do for, let's just say, 10, 15 years, so they can just keep throwing them, and would you at that point, would you advocate for giving the longer range weapons and or advocate for Ukraine actually striking within Russia?
Absolutely.
All right.
I think that without that, this becomes, kind of like our war on terror, which went on 26 years or something, and still technically, I would argue, isn't over. But we put up our big mission accomplished banner and went home.
You may have a little background noise from my end. I'll try my best to mute, but I apologize if any's coming through. All right, so I have another question. It's a long one, but I'll get to it in a sec. Please do like and subscribe. It really helps us out, and it's a great way to boost us in the algorithm. It appears, if I understand correctly, that the shills have just been struck. We were struck last week. We get struck a lot. We get struck for, quote, misinformation, which anybody who's watched this channel for more than 30 seconds knows that's not what we do. But, if you quote the President of the United States or the former president saying something inanely stupid, just by quoting it, even so that you can refute it, you can get struck. And we've usually had success with appeals, but not always. And it's a difficult system. One thing that helps is like, subscribe, and share. Why? It turns out that the bigger channels don't have this problem because they're making more revenue for YouTube. So the bigger channels and the people who are higher up in the algorithm get struck less. In some cases, say things far more egregious than we've ever done. If you like this channel, show your support. It helps us out and it helps us bring this content. So I hope you will consider that. I hope you also come to our Discord. And Commander Macmillan is there, and he is very good about answering questions and engaging people on our Discord, which we certainly appreciate. And we come to the Discord, and we have patrons. We aside from just getting struck, we also are often Commander, if you could mute, because now there's background on your end. Because we also get demonetized quite frequently. We have shown riots. We've shown a lot of violence. Sometimes that's a part of what we do when we talk about adult subjects. This video was demonetized before it aired because, as soon as you say Ukraine, and you get demonetized. So that's another way to help and support. And if you can't or aren't interested, just come on the Discord and chat with us. We always enjoy hearing from people. So thank you all for that. Commander, we've had, one of the things I love about doing this is the variety of guests that we get on. It's always been a delight talking to you. It's been a delight talking to anybody who comes on. But Starsky is an interesting one because he is in a I was going to say stage of life. I don't think it's a stage, but he is undergoing stresses that I can't even begin to imagine. And we've talked about his military background and history. He's been on the front lines actually before even the war in Ukraine started, and he's been in combat. And we've seen footage of him shooting and getting shot at, and he's been under a great deal of stress. And so to see somebody who is so just genuinely funny and interesting and such a warm guy to talk to who's undergoing this is a little surreal. But a thought had crossed my mind, which was he was on the front lines for a while, and then his commanders noticed something, which is he's a good communicator and he's a friendly guy. And they wanted someone who could go and talk to people and remind them about what's going on in Ukraine. And thank God, because that's how we get to remind people, and hopefully it influences how, at least in the U.S., we support politicians who support Ukraine. So it's a vital endeavor, because if the U.S. starts to forget about Ukraine, and if we were worried too much about our own problems, our support drops off, and Ukraine needs it. So Ukraine has people going on shows like In Time to talk to us, and I think probably it is a vital part of the war effort, without which they could easily lose the war. And yet he was a commander of a unit that is still out there, and he talks about what's happening. And one of their guys went missing. They got him back, but for 3 days nobody had any idea where he was. And these are his friends. These are people that he's fought with, and all in a war as he's trying to keep his family, the people he loves, himself, and his country alive. And he's in Kyiv. And we talked to him briefly about this, but you've seen this, so I wanted to ask you, and I'll remind you you're muted, and then I'll mute so that you guys don't hear my dog. What is that like for military people to be asked to do something like that? I mean, for me, it's like, hey, I'll do the McDonald's run. You guys, I know you guys are shooting, but we haven't had Starbucks in forever. So why don't you guys just? And I'm going to go back. But I get the impression that that's not how most people feel about it. So I wanted to get your views on that.
Yeah. Sure. I will use examples from Hollywood because they're, I think, a little more relatable. They're based on actual events, and actual people. But I want to do it because I suspect a significant portion of your audience will have seen these shows. Specifically, one called The Pacific, and the other one being Band of Brothers. And in them, and again, these are all historical cases of real people and what they did and what happened, and them talking about how they felt. So in Band of Brothers, you have a case where guys get injured, and technically they have, the golden ticket home. You have a non-crippling injury, but it's a significant enough injury, you could literally get sent home. You don't have to go back to the front. And in many, many cases, a majority of cases, troops who've been in combat, when something like that happens, they go to extraordinary lengths to try to go back to the unit they were assigned to go back to the front, to be with their brothers in arms, because the bond they have formed with those people is so, so close. Taking an example from the Pacific, there's a very famous hero in Marine Corps legend, John Basilone, who was a machine gun platoon sergeant. And he won the Medal of Honor on Guadalcanal and was then sent back to the United States to run war bond drives to generate money to support the war effort. And he talked about the incredible amount of guilt he felt about being sent back while his platoon were still fighting. He did not feel that was right. He wanted to go back with them, but he was ordered, and being a good soldier, he followed his orders. You're going back and you're going to support these bond drives. And then afterwards, when his bond drive time ran out, and they said, okay, well, we can't risk sending a war hero with the Medal of Honor back to the front. We don't want you to become a statistic of being killed in combat. You're a hero. You have so much knowledge to impart. We're going to keep you back here to train soldiers, who train other Marines who are going into combat and impart your lessons learned from your time in combat. And so he did a tour there where he was training troops. And again, he kept pestering higher authorities, saying, I want to go back into action. I want to be at the front. I want to be with my old comrades. And so they finally agreed, okay, fine, we'll send you back. And he was in the forces that landed at Iwo Jima and was killed on the first day of the attack on Iwo Jima. And here's a guy who could have very easily stayed home and knew what he was getting back into, knew the dangers, knew the suffering, knew the horrors, but still wanted to go back. And we talked to Starsky about this, about, do you like being where you are? Would you prefer to be with your friends back at the front? And honestly, he said, no, I think I'm where I should be. But I had a sense of ambivalence in that statement. I think he does feel, like many soldiers who've been in combat, a tie to those war buddies, those comrades in arms. And I think he wants to go back. At the same time, I think he understands and knows that the role he's filling now as what is effectively a public affairs officer is just, if not more valuable than anything he could be doing back at the front. But still, there's a sense of guilt that you've let down your comrades by not being there to share in their suffering and to protect them. So all that ties together with the fact that the job he's performing now, and I'm sure that what he's doing when he talks to us, when he goes on the shills and talks there, when he does his own posts, that's part of his job as a public, Ukrainian military public affairs officer, is to get the word out about what Ukraine is going through, about what's going on at the front, to project a true story. And this goes all the way back to what we talked about at the very start, which is this whole thing about the ongoing Russian bombardment of infrastructure, because the side effect of all the internet connections being out so much, we're getting far less word, far less vision of the Ukrainian side of what's going on in this war than we did before. And arguably, that may be the more profound impact of this campaign of terror bombardment than taking out the power grid, than causing the Ukrainian population to suffer, which is that the Ukrainian message of, brave Ukraine standing up to Russian aggression has been cut back, is minimized. And it is definitely a major part of this war is what's going on in the information sphere.
I remember his answer well, and I sort of got the same impression. He said, "Well, no, I'm in the military. I do as I'm ordered. Period. End of discussion." But he also said, it's like if I wanted to get into the most intense combat and kill as many Russians as possible at maximum risk to me, because then I don't get to say that, and I don't get to say, hey, put me where I'm safe. I go where I'm ordered. But yeah, I don't know. I think for a number of reasons, I wanted to make sure that we had that discussion. I think that that's always, war sucks for absolutely everybody, and there's no good place to be. There are places that are somewhat less dangerous. Doesn't mean they're a good place to be. And he's got loved ones that are, and it is a nightmare hellstorm for absolutely everybody involved. And
oh yeah, but the other side of that coin is that the bonds you form with your comrades in arms are some of the strongest you will ever have. You read some of the memoirs from the people who were in Easy Company from Band of Brothers, and this isn't on the show, although that some of it is in those little vignettes where they are interviewing the actual veterans. But I'm talking about the written accounts that many of them wrote. And they say that, even though I intensely disliked Bob Smith, I still would never have hesitated for a second to put my life on the line for him, to save him if he were in danger, because it's that sharing of danger and the sense that your life depends on the man next to you and vice versa that creates that bond, and it's kind of unbreakable. So there's definitely a stress on Starsky, I think, where he or any other Ukrainian who's been in combat wants to be back there to be part of that group because of the bonds he's formed with those people.
Well, we are very lucky to be able to see him and talk to him as often as we do, which is we've actually lucked out. We've gotten to see him a lot. We've missed him a couple of times.
Yeah.
But, with any luck, we will have him back soon. Obviously, as always, we wish Ukraine the absolute best. It's unfathomable, and we're lucky to be able to have someone explain it to us like him. Thank you, Commander, for coming. As always, your expertise is invaluable. Your flagrant disregard for YouTube ethics and my audience aside, just the constant, I don't even know what to do with it. Having a child on, I really can't. I'm sorry. Did I say any of that aloud? That's good as always to see you.
All well deserved. So yeah.
I have to get my licks in when I can, because the second I'm not on my A game, I'm getting at least as much from you, and everyone's laughing like, "Oh, he just hit Nick hard." I was like, "Dude, which side are you on? This is my audience here." But okay, Xandring, thank you as well so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. And we do have a super chat, so I'll get to that in a sec. But thank you all. It was a great show. Thank you all who've stuck with us. The super chat's all super chats during these episodes are going to the charity that Starsky directs us to, that I think is in the links down below. It's also in the previous shows. So as for all these shows, all our super chats are going 100% to that charity. It's a Ukrainian charity, but Gaming with Robin, £6. Please let us know in the Discord if you hear from Starsky, hoping he's safe. We have heard that, in fact, he's made comments on either some stream or something, so it looks like hopefully he's, well, I guess it's one's in his area. We don't know. I will. We'll keep everyone updated on the Discord. Please join us on the Discord for that and more. So thank you all very much. And we've had a busy week. We've had a lot of really good shows, and we've got a lot of shows coming up. Next week, you're going to maybe get twice as much downtime. We're going to be doing Reverend Martin Joss, who has been on In Time a couple of times. He is a minister in the UK, is going to be on to talk about forgiveness, which I think is going to be an interesting topic. We're going to have Commander McMillan back next week, as well as Starsky. So a lot planned. Thank you all for joining us, and we will, barring any breaking news, which every time barring any breaking news, we will see you guys next week. Thank you all for joining us.